Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third event for the Care Revolution series hosted by Biennale Warszawa, which is dedicated to exploring ongoing social reproduction struggles with a focus on Poland and Eastern Europe. My name is Michalina Augusiak. I am one of the curators of the series and will be moderating tonight's debate. Before we start, I would just like to remind everyone who is on Zoom with us to turn off their microphones and cameras and keep them turned off throughout the event due to data protection clauses. But during the Q&A, you will be able to sort of ask your questions in the chat. And of course, we will be following the questions that are being asked under the live stream on Facebook. So everything you write there will be transferred onto to us. Tonight's debate, the context for tonight's debate is, of course, March 8th, International Women's Day, which is coming up on Monday. So we wanted to connect this month's event to International Women's Day, but give it a very particular and regional context. We wanted to include groups and researchers and activists working with feminist and labor struggles in Eastern Europe, but also focus on the question of transnational solidarity, which has for many years been central to the to International Women's Day political agenda and organizing. The political and theoretical background for this and the series in general is a strong focus on reproductive labor and social reproduction, which is an aspect of feminist and feminist Marxist, to be specific, theorizing, which has become increasingly, I think, important for understanding today's world, and which has become increasingly more discussed and visible as the pandemic is going on. But even though social reproduction theory, which has a very universal approach to exploring and explaining the economic underbelly of our world and the importance of reproductive labor that is mostly being done by women and migrant women, especially in our world. Despite its universal scope, the classic works of social reproduction theory usually emerged as critiques of capitalist welfare economies. And a lot of them have focused on more Western Anglophone economies and societies, but increasingly Eastern European scholars and activists have made the effort to take the language of social reproduction, which has a lot of sources, obviously, and explore, use it in order to explore the labor and the feminist struggles going on in our region. And we have a great group of guests tonight, of panelists who have been involved in supporting reproductive struggles in the regions, studying them, writing about them. I'm going to very briefly introduce them and give them the space to give us a bit more insight into their activities themselves. But just to briefly introduce everyone, our first guest is Anna Vilenica, who is an urban and cultural researcher and feminist and housing activist, and a member and representative of EAST, Essential Autonomous Struggles Transnational, a network of feminist and labor groups organizing throughout Europe, transnationally. Another member of EAST that we have with us is Sopiko Japaridze, who is the co-founder and chair of the Independent Union Solidarity Network in Georgia, and who has been for many years a labor organizer in the US and Georgia. We have also joining us Olena Lutsenko, who is a PhD candidate in political science, York University in Toronto, and sort of connects a Ukrainian and a Canadian perspective. And last but not least, our guest is also Julia Kubisa, who's a lecturer in social science at the University of Warsaw. So I'm just going to sort of give the mic over to you, and let's sort of make a short introduction round where you can sort of speak about your activism, how you understand your activism in relation to Eastern Europe, and that sort of political identity, and give us a bit more insight to your political academic biographies. Anna, maybe you can start.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on this occasion. And I'm very happy to represent this very new transnational network of essential workers East. And I'm very happy to be part of it. So my name is Anna Vilenica. I'm a feminist and a housing activist and researcher for many years now. In the plan of the discussion, this was a part where we should speak about our political biography, and I really kind of like this approach. So I really got to think about my political biography, and it is quite long now, like for, let's say, 20 years. I started as a person that was involved in peace activism and feminist activism in the late 90s and the beginning of 2000s. And then I realized that the feminism that was, and the discussions around the feminism that we had in Serbia as an ex-Yugoslav country was not actually addressing the issues and the problems that I felt. And, I really needed this to build this space. So I think that for my political biography, this book is very important. So it's the book called Becoming a Mother in Neoliberal Capitalism that I edited in 2013. I started working on it in 2010 already. But this is and it has a second edition from 2016. So this is the book where I actually, try to map this field of feminism in a different way. So all of these ideas that we will discuss today are mapped in this book. They are kind of fragmented because at that point, nothing was very integrated. But there is ideas about social reproduction, about the human or women's strike, and also the idea about the radical intersectionality of different oppressions. So, I mean, this is that was a starting point for me. And recently I have been involved in housing struggles. I'm a member of anti-eviction organization called The Roof in Serbia. There has been like an epidemic of evictions happening in the last 3 years in Serbia. And I got this as my task, to try to read, to live this housing struggles for social reproduction, what they actually are, because housing is a basic infrastructure of social reproduction. And I have been, trying to analyze these issues from this perspective, stating and showing how our countries, especially Serbia, failed us in the means of producing the social reproduction. I studied like housing as a failed social reproduction infrastructure, and I have been also focusing on the labor of radical housing politics. Because this is, additional reproductive labor that people who are in the anti-eviction struggles have to do as well. So yeah, I have been also active in organizing feminist marches and trying to introduce this perspective on strike in a very complex feminist surrounding in Serbia. This year we will not have a march because of the pandemics, but also because of different conflicts that we can talk later. So I will stop here, and yeah, maybe we can discuss further these points later. Thank you.
Thank you. So Sopo, could you?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for hosting this and for us to be here today. I'm very interested in speaking with all of you. It's always such a pleasure. I'm currently, I live in Georgia, but I was an immigrant when I was 8 years old to the US, and I grew up there, and I moved back to Georgia. And I've been, activist since I was very young. And the last, I would say, I don't know, 10 to 12 years, I've been a labor organizer in different unions, also as a student organizer, a student labor, and also student organizer. And then now I'm a chair of a local independent union, which I didn't have any plans to actually start my own union. It just so happens that the old one didn't accept us. So now we mostly have members that are women who work in the social reproductive sphere. They are nurses, social welfare workers, we have another new social workers union, which we're also part of together. So it's therapists and so on. So we have lots of mostly women who work in social reproduction. Of course, we have a few other members. It's kind of like a general union, but it kind of ends up by default like a care workers union. We've been also just one of the biggest problems in Georgia is migration. So a lot of Georgian women are migrants in Western Europe working as care workers there. That also gives us like a false economy here through remittances. That's actually harder to fight for wages. And I'll talk more about that here, because when you concentrate on organized union, but everyone keeps going and leaving, like it's really difficult. And why it's also important, like social reproduction, to have that framework, which is very much so missing, because often they consider non-productive work, like the social work is like social care work is generally like non-productive work. It's not directly tied to profit, so therefore it's the most ignored. And of course it's the women that mostly fill them as well, because they're not considered important in general. And I'm saying this, I'm laughing, and I'm not like laughing at this, but just the absurdity of the situation. And I hope I can talk to more about Georgia and how it relates to international context, and having the sort of both frameworks of being from, the metropole of sort of capitalism, US, and then being in Georgia. You see this like super capitalist US and then super capitalist marginal periphery, so like it's kind of interesting framework. I have not seen any, I've never lived in Europe, so I don't know the Western European model very well. Like it's but I know these like two very drastic versions of capitalism, and how horrible they both are. So I would like to tell you more about that. And I'm part of EAST as well, and I'm very happy that EAST kind of came out of the pandemic. This trip, we were supposed to have a meeting in Bulgaria, it never happened, and sort of EAST was formed from it. So something even more beautiful has come from it, and I hope it gets stronger and more people join it. Thank you.
Julia, could you go next?
Yes, so thank you very much for having me here, for the invitation. I'm really happy that we can talk and exchange our Central Eastern Europe experiences. And I think it is interesting that there are not, well, from my perspective, there are not that many occasions, as we very often tend to look on the West side and look for inspirations and look for the histories and strategies, and they somehow do not fit well. Therefore, I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I was really inspired by the manifesto, and I think it's a great opportunity. What about me? As Michalina already said, I work at the Faculty of Sociology at the University of Warsaw, where I study gendered division of labor mostly. And in my academic career and my academic interests are around gender and work and women in trade unions. When I started being interested in women and trade unions, it was when I was a PhD student. It was not something that was an obvious combination of topics, because women or gender and the labor market were more associated with glass ceiling, management, private sector issues, and I was for some time looking for my path and for my how to understand the topic of industrial relations, which was then considered as something old and not very not something that fits in properly with the capitalist economy. My interest and my research was about women and trade unions, and especially care sector. So what was interesting, fascinating, and for me was the nurses and midwives struggles, and their militant profile of their union. The fight for the recognition of the value of care work, the recognition of the professional aspect of care work, and the very specific dilemmas that the people who continue worker struggles in care sector face. So the specific triangle between the worker, the employer, and the patients, or generally the people who are cared for. So this is the topic that is still interesting for me. And recently was Katarzyna Rakowska, who also participated in one of the seminars in this series. We are researching various struggles in care sector, in formal work, in informal work. And what we found fascinating is that they never stop, even in pandemic. I think generally care sector is the place for the trade unions and for the inspiration and for generally for political struggles. As for my profile, I was a feminist activist for many years, and I started in the very, very early 2000s. I was a member of the 8th of March coalition in Warsaw, and for many years I cooperated, contributed, and also observed how the feminist movement was developing in Poland, with the abortion rights always on the banners, and various coalitions, various challenges, how to build a feminist profile in a society that was not self-identifying, or economy that was not identified as capitalist for many years. Now at the moment, nowadays I would rather identify myself as more as an academic than activist. But I'm also responsible for the equality policies at the University of Warsaw, so there is still some activist part in me, but more in an administrative way. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Olena, could you go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. First, I wanted to thank everyone who's attending this event. Also, big thanks to the organizers, Michalina and Marta, for inviting me and for dealing with all the administrative paperwork. And I also want to express like my appreciation and respect for the co-participants and the impressive work that you all do. It's amazing to connect with other people working on or in Eastern Europe and to have this discussion on Eastern Europe and social reproduction. I think it's very overdue, so I'm very excited to share that today with you. Also, I guess we should acknowledge all the social reproductive work that made us, happen and possible here today. So including our households and communities and neighborhoods. So as Michalina has already mentioned, I work and live in Toronto. I'm currently writing my dissertation, which attempts to do a kind of a critique of Soviet political economy, centering social reproduction, showing how in the story of the making of the Soviet project and its transformation, reproductive activities have been kind of, taken away and neglected as sites for political struggle and as sites for big picture political economic processes, and generally as like the very making of history. So I draw on social reproduction feminism and trace the transformation of the gender contract and social citizenship model from the Soviet to the post-Soviet era, focusing on Russia in particular. For the contemporary neoliberal period, neoliberal era, which is a part of it, is I explore maternity capital benefit. It's a kind of a cash transfer program to mothers introduced under the Putin administration. And I'm trying to make the case that it is in fact a kind of a financialization of social reproduction and also a part of an ongoing primitive accumulation since the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course here, I'm also exploring some of the housing crisis situation in Russia in particular. So it's interesting also to hear Anna's research interests in her work. At the very moment though, I'm working on a chapter looking into Stalin's first 5-year plan, the collectivization of agriculture and peasant women's revolts. I guess that they were at the front lines of the struggle against collectivization. And I'm trying to understand this process as a process of also primitive accumulation in the kind of a Marxist sense, as a separation of workers from the means of subsistence. And I'm using social reproduction lens precisely to understand what alienation of land and labor meant for women in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. But anyway, because I'm based in Toronto, my political involvement, I guess, has also been here mostly. So since last March, so now a year ago at the outset of the pandemic, I've been involved with a neighborhood organization called Keep Your Rent Toronto. It's basically tenants coming together collectively in the Greater Toronto area who have been organizing a rent strike in their neighborhoods. So this is working class, immigrant, Black people, and they're keeping their rent because they lost their work, their jobs, they got sick, they are immunocompromised, or, all kinds of crises that have been, sort of the consequences of the mismanagement and failing inadequate infrastructures preceding to COVID-19. So instead of banning evictions, the provincial government has placed a moratorium on the enforcement of evictions. So they're just coming later now. after like big COVID peaks. So we continue to organize to defend against evictions, to expose the capitalist state and the police as a kind of the surveillance wing of the capitalist state, which protect landlords in expropriating working class households through higher rent increases above guidelines, like rent increases, poor, unfair living conditions, etc. We don't really have affordable housing in Toronto right now. There's a housing crisis, and it has been there for quite some time, but really has become worsened with the Conservative government in power in the last few years. So of course, the evictions take place in neighborhoods like where immigrants, poor, Black people live. And of course, this is also the worst neighborhoods in terms of COVID cases, but also neighborhoods where frontline workers live, right? Who are engaged in feminized labor, nurses, personal support workers, etc., etc. So with my dear friend and comrade, Lina, we've co-authored an article recently in The Spectre in an attempt to kind of think about the rent strike as a form of working class struggle at the point of reproduction that Anna was just talking about. We argue that the struggle for housing is about immediate life-making needs, sometimes more important, more immediate to working class people than, say, a fight for, a higher minimum wage. And we are kind of writing about neighborhood struggles for self-defense against financialization, against gentrification and police brutality, and how often these struggles historically have been relegated to the personal, to the kind of private, non-economic sphere, and not seen as part of the production process, as part of like fighting against capitalism. Yeah, I think that's a lot. So I'll stop now.
Okay, thank you all very much. We're gonna move on to a series of open questions now that sort of each of our panelists can answer, sort of give a bit more details on either sort of her local perspective, sort of, or a broader analysis. I want to start by asking all of you to sort of maybe conceptualize and sort of problematize the idea of Eastern Europeanness in general, and how that sort of plays out in terms of broader political struggles, and also sort of the task of global internationalist solidarity. Because I think what Sopo mentioned in terms of a lot of Georgian women working as migrant care laborers in the sort of more affluent countries of Western Europe, that's sort of the case for, well, most Eastern European countries, right? That's something that really defines the sort of economic character of the region. I think that's sort of one of the, along with low labor costs, I think that's sort of one of the key characteristics, economic characteristics of the region, high levels of migration that is connected to care labor. So that's sort of something that really makes centering reproductive labor in Eastern European feminism really crucial. But sort of, I'm wondering how, and I'm sure that sort of in East has had discussions about that. How would you sort of understand and sort of vocalize as well the tensions between, well, identifying as a sort of Eastern European feminism and then connecting to broader international struggles in other peripheries of capitalism, which experience similar economic processes, maybe even to a more extreme sort of extent, but also connecting to feminist struggles in the capitalist center, in the metropole. And since both Sopo and Olena have sort of the experience of connecting the perspective of the periphery and the metropole, I'm especially interested in your answers. So just whoever wants to go first.
This is a very complicated question.
Yes, but I think we need to sort of
hard from.
We only have 2 hours.
Great. I mean, I can start. I mean, I can try to start thinking, you know, like this issue, and then I'm sure like all of you can add on that. I mean, I think that this particular historical moment is much better than the one we had like 20 years ago, because, you know, like I went all through like the 2000s, the first decade, you know, it was still this narrative of, you know, like East Europe being very behind of things, this kind of narratives of East Europe being in a position to catch up with the West. I mean, all the analysis of housing struggles, for instance, I mean, most of them, like coming from Serbian context, are written in this key. It's like when you write it, it's like, oh, this is like everything fell apart. You know, we are still not there. We have to try better. You know, to join this. You know, like. Progressive world of capitalism, but it was never meant to be this way. This was just an ideology, this story that was sold to people, and the narrative, ideological narrative that we have found ourselves in. So I mean, there was different phases that we had to like struggle against, like Balkanization narratives, for instance, in relationship to ex-Yugoslavia and the wars in 1990s. But I think now we are in a kind of better position, because there is a lot of thinking about, there's a lot of like decolonial narrative, let's say, forming around, starting from like different schools of thought, like also, I don't know, world system theory that offered this apparatus of like center periphery, semi-periphery. I mean, it is something that kind of opens this space for us to think these power relations on a more global level. So I think it is, you know, a task to think this both like local specificities, problems on the ground that we have, and see like where the cause is, you know, like in this kind of geopolitical sphere. And it is very complicated. And this is why I'm very happy that there is this transnational platform, because I think that many of our problems are not local and we cannot solve them locally. I mean, I have been recently involved in a research project studying the forex debt. This is the loans that people in Serbia took in 2006, 7, 8, around economic crisis, in foreign currencies, especially in Swiss francs. And they ended up in the huge debt. But this was, I mean, this was the issue of peripheral financialization, the entrance of foreign banks and having completely other, you know, settings, relationships, set of relationships that brought in the periphery. So this is, I mean, these geopolitical relations are very important, not only in this issue, but in all others. This is just one stream that we can take and study maybe. But there are others. I mean, if we go, we can talk also from the grassroots. I mean, what you, Michelina, proposed to do, like, you know, put it in a relationship like core countries and peripheral countries. I also have a little bit of experience of living in London. But I will just focus on one tiny thing, because I mean, I have to say that I am a member of the East as an individual and not as a part of a collective, simply because there is a lot of discussions and atomization happening at the moment in the feminist scene in Serbia. And one of the causes is the import of these so-called turf wars and trans-exclusionary politics from the UK into Serbia, that kind of like completely, you know, dismantled this base, the common base of feminism that we had for years, where we as a kind of like radical left feminists tried to intervene in, and we had this dialogue with more liberal streams and the streams that were focusing on some issues that were not, let's say, I don't know, labor related and so on. So there is definitely, you know, this kind of very complex landscape that we are working in, that we have to take into account. I mean, transnational organizing it's not easy, and I have some experience like in housing, transnational organizing. My collective, The Roof, is part of the European Action Coalition for Right to Housing in the City. So this is the place where we are trying to organize on European level. It is very slow, it is very complicated. I mean, there also we had this needs to kind of like try to find our niche, you know, East Europeans, because of our different experience. But then also, you know, like there is new divisions inside. For instance, Serbia is not the member of European Union, and for instance, Romania or Bulgaria are. So it again changes the situation a lot. So there are all of these like very, very complex issues that we also have to kind of, you know, put out there and think about them. In the East, I'm very happy because this space is finally opened, but it will take us a lot of work, you know, like to bring this very local discussions to this international level. I can just say one more example that goes into the direction of what you were mentioning related to the migration work, and I can relate it to housing structures, but I will just tell you a story. So this is the story of a woman that I have been working with in the frame of the Roof, this anti-eviction organization. So she squatted a social flat, because there is also mismanagement of social flats in Serbia. And at the end, somehow we managed to bargain that they leave her stay there and wait for another open call. But she also accumulated a lot of debt because she didn't have means. She's a single mom of 2 kids. She didn't have means to pay heating bills. So she had to leave her children and go to Germany to work as a carer in order to be able, you know, to earn some money, to pay these bills, to be able to extend her stay in the squatted social flat. So it's, yeah, maybe just to open the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Who's next? Anyone up for?
I will continue, I guess, how we went before.
Let's keep the order.
Yeah. What everyone has been saying so far, Olena, I really want to talk to you. I would love to know more about your research, by the way. Sounds amazing. Yeah, I agree with, you know, Anna. And I think there's like, I mean, first of all, I don't know, like it's contentious issue if Georgia's part of Europe or not. I mean, most people say, you know, most people, I mean, like elite discourse is like, we are European, as like a way to say we're not pro-Russia. And there's like pro-Russia, and like I'm sure in Poland they have similar, just like Russia or the West, and it's just like it makes everything horrible. You cannot get through a discussion. It's like polarized and crazy, and everyone thinks Russia's behind everything, and it's like you're in a very conspiratorial place where you can't have a normal discussion. So most people don't even acknowledge capitalism is happening. They think like Russia's behind it all. Like I can't even describe, because I don't understand logically how any of this works, because it's beyond logic often for me. So I think there's so much discourse that makes it impossible to have a normal, more, you know, conversation that could actually be potentially better and productive to move forward. We're still stuck in that we are behind, we are like pretty much like we're losers, like this very hatred of self that we are like, you know, like Americans, like, you know, they do horrible things all the time, and there's like every 2 minutes, like there's someone, you know, kills someone gets like whatever, like there's a million things happening all the time, you know, it's like horrible. And no American's like, oh, it's because we're American, like we do these terrible things. But in Georgia, like one thing happens and self-hatred just piles on. Oh, it's because we're so regressive. We can't just like ever be civilized. We will never get to the EU like this, you know? So for me, it's too hard. Like like this is like basic kind of, but like in order for you to demand something for yourself, you kind of have to love yourself. And if you hate yourself, you don't actually have high expectations. So then you end up sort of tolerating a lot of like abuse and exploitation because you somehow think that you are too backwards to develop. It's like dealing with someone who has like complex, so like I hate psychoanalysis and whatever, like, but it kind of weighs like the whole country has like a inferiority complex. So it makes it very difficult to move forward. Yet the exact same problems are happening everywhere, of course, in post-communist world where it's, you know, it's complete drop, right, collapse, everything just like, it's like a free fall for the first 90. Some countries got off, you know, better or worse. Georgia was one of those that was very hooked on the Soviet Union. It was like most of the economy was coming from there and everything. So it had a harder time, you know, like it started worse than everybody else did. And so you have a country that's went through a much worse crisis than everyone else. And also it's a very small place. So the economy, as far as industrialization stuff, is very weak. And there's, of course, the deindustrialization happens a much worse way than most of other Eastern European countries and post-communist. So you already have like, you just have like sort of say degrees of things, like same things happen, but you just get degrees. So like Poland and the Czech Republic, they go through a much, you know, the closer you are to Europe, the easier time you kind of had. Let's just say, let's be like real. The farther you go, the worse it gets as far as how much pain you have like taken, because more Western Europe is invested in you, propping you up, right? So you don't go into back to communism, right? You don't want that. So they're more likely to have supported you. And so Georgia's like on the like Caucasus, like no one cares, right? And they've been really the only people that have been really, really interested at first were these sort of right-wing Americans who were like, yes, screw Russia, and we are like war. So like we've had this really strange like development, sort of intellectual development of the country has been very right-wing, very libertarian, hawkish. And so, and also there's almost no economy. It's very FD, like they're waiting for FDI, but no FDI knows to come there because no, you know, it's not connected to anything. And so social reproductive is based on put like taxes in, right? Like some kind of like state services for people, like free kindergartens and so on, right? Healthcare, that gets really like destroyed almost. Like the whole social safety net is dropped off. And then you have very, very bad service sector that's coming in, like transportation and like selling things. Everyone's like a merchant, like overnight, literally everyone's a merchant, right? So all you can do is sell things, petty things. So women, so there's no jobs for men. It's like not, it's really, there's just no industrial work for them anymore. They don't know how to deal with it because they've had, you know, guaranteed jobs. The women sort of take over and they're not embarrassed to sell things. You know, men are like, I'm a man, I can't sell things, you know, like, so the women sort of go into this workforce, this very low paid, really bad workforce, and they become more dominant in that. And then also they move as fast as possible. So it's interesting because most men move to Russia and most women move to Western Europe. It really is like gendered. In Russia, they become like small merchants or whatever they do, right? Plus the language is like not as hard. They'll go somewhere they already know the language, you know, Russian. You know, Western Europe, you don't know, no one knows Italian or whatever. And so all the women go to do care work and they're supporting these, propping up these families back home. Almost every single person has, you know, an immigrant. And then you think that in the early 2000s, you think this new government came, it's going to somehow, things are going to get better, but he just sort of increases sort of, and Elena, I'm really glad you use primitive accumulation rapidly and in financialization alongside it. So everything's becoming private, and what used to be like utilities that didn't come very often, but it was free. Now you're paying very high prices. Everything gets very privatized, right? This sort of social set just kind of shrinks. And then you have a huge amount of debts. One of the highest in the world is in Georgia. You have severe debt crisis. And then people, just like Anna said, have to move to other countries to pay off the debt as well. So it just exacerbates the immigration. And then you have this current government that actively just works with governments to get like you know, picking fruit and other kinds of programs to get Georgians out because they can't create jobs and they don't want social unrest. They're just sort of peeling off constant layers of people to go work there. So Georgia and other countries very similar. I would just say just like because we're sort of at the end, we see things a little bit, it's like a lot worse in some ways. And then it's interesting because housing, Alina said, was very interesting, Anna, like housing, the wages are very low. It's like 100 euros, less than 100 euros a month. But that's because they're expecting most people to have homes from the Soviet Union. So if you actually factored in housing, that would be like you would be homeless in 2 seconds because there's no way you could pay that. It's at least 100 euros more, 200 euros more to get a flat. So they're using Soviet Union like gotten sort of things that people had like housing, right? And also factories, everything. They use literally just only Soviet Union stuff. They haven't created like anything new. It's also another phenomenon that's here. But so they're using the reason, wages are so low because they're expecting family, right? Family to take care of you. They're expecting that you have a house. They're expecting that you have a village. So if you get really hungry, you could get cow there or something and you don't go starving. So you never actually fight. There's always ways to like, it's like a sieve, keeps pouring. So you can't ever quite catch them to like really hit a certain point of social crisis. And then you have all these people constantly being, taken into off to migration. So you have all these ways that they're constantly manipulating and keeping certain social dynamics alive and unrest down. Sorry, I might have talked too much, and I don't know if it's too much information, but let me know.
It's fine. Olena, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, I totally agree, and like there's so much to say, and I like totally agree with what Sopiko has been saying, and I think that there's a general like feminization of precarious work, like precarious employment globally, right? And so as Michalina and also Sopiko and Anna, like as you've all mentioned, Eastern European women play a particular role in immigrating, including to Canada, as my mother, and taking up care work that that women here don't want to do anymore or are liberated from, and enter another kind of, like a workforce that is like doing other things, right? Like important things, quotation marks. So of course we were like personally in my life, my mother was that person who was sending remittances and still is back home, right? On which Ukraine, and I come from Eastern Ukraine where the war is happening now, which was really deindustrialized after the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, women were in the service economy, men lost work mostly. And this idea of going back into the home that a lot of people were writing about, that, oh, now the fall of the Soviet Union or state socialist economies will force women back into the home, was false, right? Because as we know, women took the brunt actually of caring and supporting their families and working outside in the most precarious jobs, at least I think in Ukraine, this was the case, and in Russia. And so now the measuring the ruler of Europeanization, or the ruler of Europeanness, is really like coming to Ukraine and measuring, like that's where it's at, the border of who's in and who's out, I feel like. And of course this discourse of we are European and liberal versus like backward Russian whatever and communist, and this conflation of the both camps is really problematic, because in fact what the policies that they're implementing are very similar. They are neoliberal reforms in Russia in a very like centralized way, using the state, and now in Ukraine in a way that's more of a withdrawal of the state, restructuring of the state, privatization and so on. But I think, as Sopik also I think has written in a beautiful article in the Jacobin, which points out that they are different policies, they are different versions of neoliberalism, and yet there's something similar in all of them. It's a restructuring, and it is financialization, and it's also kind of a primitive accumulation of all the public sphere that was there previously, and the social citizenship model that was there previously for women also, including for women. So this now grabbing and like privatizing and restructuring that space is what's happening everywhere. But we need to actually understand it as a kind of a universal process rather than no, Russia has stayed like it's this very strange analysis, like the Russian state is a capitalist neoliberal, really bad like policies, like it's a capitalist state, and yet by Europe versus the other, there's a lot of confusion, I think, and it's a slippery slope. So I think we need to go back to that political economic like analysis. Yeah.
So I think that it's really interesting that I'm the last one in this round because I think if we look at this, at what you said and at your questions, Michalina, from the Polish perspective, we can ask what comes next. I mean, I would certainly say that there are many links between Poland and Georgia, and Poland and Ukraine and Serbia in terms of this sort of tension between the longing for Europeanness and the accusations of the communist, post-communist so-called burdens like social policy that turned out to be very expensive or inappropriate or unmodern, all this rhetoric of 1990s in Poland. So we had the European liberals, we had the accusations, as I said, that anything that is some kind of, that is connected to social policy and especially to social reproduction, like care infrastructure, is something that is not needed in a capitalist system, and which actually translated into transferring the burden on the families and especially on women. So I don't even want to repeat what you said because it happened here as well. But the thing is that I think that Poland now is in a different place, and it's been going on for more or less 10 years. So I would say that the first phase, the 1990s, was the neoliberal reforms, which were never called neoliberal. They were called modernization, that were called transformation. So we never knew the word. So which actually shows that language and discourse are very powerful. We never said it was capitalism, it was usually free economy in opposition to the coordinated, or not coordinated, the planned economy of state socialism time. So then there was this longing for Europeanness and the adjustment, and the real high hopes also from on the feminist side that there will be some kind of, I don't want to say civilizing of the standards, but there were different hopes connected to the membership and the entrance, the membership to the European Union. Because what I think is quite unique in Poland is the issue of reproductive rights. So there have been two streams that go together from the early 1990s, and one was the neoliberal transformation, and the second was the huge backlash on reproductive rights. So we had the abortion is practically banned from the early 1990s. It was with 3 exceptions. Now from last year it was 2 exceptions. So there were high hopes in the feminist movement that the European Union will bring us freedom in terms of reproductive rights, but this never actually happened. And I think this was the first sign that there are certain limits in this European community when it comes to the citizen freedom issues. But when I said freedom, it's more about reproductive rights. I would say that women were the first ones to discover that actually nothing will change. Like women were first to discover that the so-called free market economy brings more problems than solutions. So this was mid-2000s when Poland entered European Union, and still until I would say 2010, this discourse on the cuts, the necessary cuts, was prevailing, especially in terms of social policy. But I would say that from the 2010, we can see some kind of rediscovery of social issues. And at first it was very timid. Political parties, for example, rediscovered nurseries and kindergartens that perhaps we cannot ask women to, or tell women to stay at home until their children are school age, because, and here is the new thing, because we need them on labor market. So it's, again, it's not about women empowerment or women independence or women, like whatever choices. It's more about the economy and taxes and like moving people from one place to another without the recognition of their contributions. But from 2010, more or less, even the liberal political parties started discussing subsidizing childcare and investing in childcare, and this was one thing. But what you obviously probably know is that from 2015 we have this Law and Justice government, which introduced completely new narrative. So it's not liberal, neoliberal anymore. It's based on the first of all on the idea of generous state and giving power back to people, giving agency back to people, which of course is a narrative. It never happens, but it's this populist turn is very important here, because it shows that we have to always ask what will come after neoliberalism and what kind of scenarios are we ready for after neoliberalism. And here in Poland, we are already testing it. So, I mean, when we look at the political parties, perhaps except for the left, the new left that we have now, they are still like struggling with adjusting to, or like answering this this kind of tones in political narrative, and the tones that are giving back, that are about the state that is giving its citizens something like the generous childcare benefits or raising minimum wage even higher than the trade unions want to. This is interesting that the social dialogue in Poland is based on a situation that trade unions are offering something and the government says, well, we'll give more because we can, because we are actually ignoring social dialogue, but we are pretending that we are participating in it, because every benefit, everything should come from the state, not from the social actors, not from the society. So it is completely new power dynamic. But that's one thing. But if I still have time, I'd like to add one more thing. Is when we what do we like feel and think about the position of Central Eastern Europe, being in Central Eastern Europe, and when I think about this Polish membership in European Union, and I mean now we are visible because of Law and Justice government, I mean it's hard not to acknowledge what is happening here, but when I think about the discussions that I had among international scholars before 2015, I always felt that we are kind of a gray zone that is omitted in the global analysis. So it was usually the North and West and the global South. And somehow the situation of Central Eastern Europe countries, especially the ones that are that belong to the European Union, did not fit in the picture. So they were, I mean, as a person who researched the situation in the healthcare sector, which means very difficult working conditions, very low pay, very low wages, huge overtime. So something completely different than the so-called European social model. When I was talking about it in the discussions or conferences or whatever, people were like, they were rejecting it as something that should not happen in European Union because these are not European standards. And this is another narrative that we are struggling with, to acknowledge that those things are actually happening here and they are happening in European Union.
Thanks. I think I would like to sort of sum up everything you've said before we move on to the next question, just to sort of structure everything. I think it's really interesting to sort of see that there's a really sort of shared idea of what the sort of components of this sort of structure of, you know, ideology on top of peripheral economy really constitutes, and like somehow this idea of, you know, placing all these countries on some sort of sliding scale of how far from the origin, how far from, you know, the easternmost extremum we are. But I think what it really shows beyond just like these specific problems that sort of you have to deal with on a daily basis in terms of political life, it really does show sort of a common structure that is just incredibly visible, and that sort of makes it quite easy to just, you know, point out the biggest obstacles in terms of organizing. And I'd sort of like to maybe move on with the next question to sort of, do we acknowledge that, right? Sort of, because I think the things that you've mentioned would be, one, the sort of post-Cold War modernization paradigm that sort of posits Eastern Europe as backwards, which is something that all of Eastern Europe has dealt with on like an ideological or a history of consciousness level. That has, of course, been challenged to different degrees in terms of just local intellectual life. And that's important, but that sort of, no matter how much that sort of gets questioned, it's to some degree always there, right? That sort of does, at least from the outside, that's going to be there. Second, I think a huge obstacle to transnational movements in particularly would be the hegemony of nationalist discourses, and also sort of racialized discourses, racialized nationalisms, that make it sort of difficult to organize transnationally, that I think is the sort of second central obstacle. Then something that Anna, you have mentioned, and Julia as well, is that sort of liberal aspirations of local feminist movements and sort of how much feminist organizing, especially sort of in the 90s, early 2000s, really got involved in that sort of, and limited to a very sort of liberal statist aspirations in terms of what actors sort of matter politically, and in which spheres feminism is even an actor politically. And I actually think that what you, Anna, mentioned in terms of the import of TERFism and sort of trans-exclusionary feminism from Britain and the UK, that has totally happened in Poland as well. That's actually sort of why I put up, my slide is blocking it, but I did put up a poster of no liberation without trans liberation, because it is a problem, and I think that's not a problem that we can easily sort of separate from the sort of decades-long conflict around class. I think it is actually a conflict that sort of is a way of voicing a certain resentment by some liberal feminists who are sort of not agreeing to not being as important by having their sort of political platform questioned in other ways. I think that's sort of one way of them expressing it in a very toxic way. So I think we have all these sort of negative obstacles, negative aspects of sort of the political economy of Eastern Europe, the sort of nationalist ideology that I think is shared by a lot of us, a lot of our localities, and then sort of the character of feminist organizing to date. And I'm interested in how you think we as left feminists, socialist feminists, social reproduction feminists should engage with that, or should we engage with that at all? Because I think the thing that is really interesting and fresh, so to speak, about what East is doing, and I think that term autonomous is really important here in the name of the platform, is really sort of not really focusing on challenging all of these obstacles, all of these actors sort of directly in a way that's going to really make these problematic political actors the sort of recipients of our discourse, recipients of our activism, but more really sort of focusing on specific problems, specific struggles, specific workplaces. And I think that is something that we need to be doing. That is really important to just go beyond this paradigm of, just limiting our sort of political horizon to what has been for so many years set by capitalist political economy, nationalist states, and liberal feminism, and sort of really focusing on building our own movements, own structures, own organizing support workers, and sort of make that the center of our feminism, the center of our activism. So I would like to know what your stance on that is, that sort of strategy, and what do you think we can sort of achieve with that? How do we achieve that? How do we build that sort of movement? So whichever one of you wants to go first, Elena.
Maybe I'll go first, but I have like a long, I have like an indirect maybe way of answering this question. I think that that first and foremost, like what I liked in the East manifesto, right? I think that a transnational feminist struggle is a struggle against capitalism, including patriarchy, sexism, racism, settler colonialism. Things that aren't relegated to the cultural realm, but actually are part of political economy and a part of capitalism. So I would advocate going back to, and at the bottom of that also is a private family form, a heteronormative private family form. And that is an elephant in the room that we have left from, you know, former Soviet Union or state socialism that hasn't been addressed. And I guess the way that I think about it now, what's interesting to me now is that in recent years, there has been a real heightened sense of this idea that life was better under socialism, right? We all know Kristen Gottsi's book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. So there has been a renewed kind of wave of research interest in state socialist women's organizations and Eastern Bloc feminisms, especially in the 60s, 70s sort of eras.
I'd say the 50s when it comes to Poland, actually. I'd say that in the case of Poland, it would be the 40s and 50s, actually, not.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, sure. And so there's like numerous sociological opinion polls as well, like at least in Russia, Ukraine also, for a certain nostalgia for the state socialist, kind of real existing socialist, whatever term you want to say, past. And so I ask myself, right, like, what is the current context in which this real need to rethink the Soviet project or bring it back has emerged? Like, why now? And I guess it is quite different than the 90s liberal democracy and free markets and the trickle down naive kind of beliefs, you know? I think that the nostalgia for the Soviet past in Russia and Ukraine kind of appears in the midst of 2 decades, right, of austerity and clawing back of the social citizenship models of state socialist regimes. And so, of course, as you've all mentioned, and, you know, it was so interesting to hear Julia speak of the case in Poland, the way in which the neoconservative and the neoliberal kinds of like ideologies come together. I think that's very interesting, and that they're not mutually exclusive necessarily, right? But they are necessarily built on this private family form. But anyway, so this austerity, the 2 decades of austerity, decommunization laws, pension, healthcare, childcare, land reforms, return to the heteronormative family values, a return, criminalization of abortion, contraception, etc., police brutality, as we see in the case of Russia and Belarus very recently, right? So I think what we should do, I guess, is I think that we must actually cherish the nostalgia for the Soviet past, but cherish it critically, in the sense of reading this nostalgia for the past as a nostalgia for an alternative, right? Kind of a, and I think that I propose, I think following Angela Davis, we should also understand the Soviet project, or what was real existing socialism, as one of productive, like a productive contradiction or unfinished activism, or a sort of a history of an unfulfilled promises, right, that give rise to new activisms in the present and in the future. And I think that a part of understanding those contradictions and dealing with those contradictions is about thinking about the private family form and the way in which the social reproductive labor still was private, right? Certainly. And the way, of course, in which now the neoliberal restructuring that takes myriad forms across post-socialist states, and we've talked about this so much already, that it actually uses that private family form, right, in a new way, in a new political economic way. So I think it's important to address that, and I think certain certainly this new revival of going back, or this new revival of that was better, I think, well, better for whom and in what way, and what does it mean to win radically, not just to give a bit more pension, but to win radically, to really transform. And the one thing that did not transform was the private kind of the social reproduction that was private to the family, right? To the heteronormative, nonetheless, private nuclear family form. And in many ways, state socialist regimes, like I think in the Soviet Union, it actually built the new nuclear family form with primitive accumulation at the beginning, like in the 30s, I think under Stalin in the Soviet Union. So I think this alienation of labor and the separation of production and reproduction, that at the center of that is women's work that is privatized, and we need to deal with that history. I think that's kind of answering that, hopefully.
I'm very much in agreement with what you said in terms of this recent period of historical scholarship on Eastern European women's organizations, state organizations, and sort of women's rights reforms. I think it was a sort of, that period was a symptom of really sort of trying to really answer this sort of capitalist hegemonic discourse. But it is something that we really strongly need to go beyond. And this has been sort of something that I've been sort of grappling with myself in my research, sort of historical research as well. And that I think we need to really sort of look beyond it, and the way you phrase it is really great. So I think that's a promising project.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to say one more thing that I forgot to mention. And I think it's also part of kind of thinking about what the promise was about, you know, and we are celebrating Rosa Luxemburg's 150th birthday, I guess, today and tomorrow. And in 1901, Alexandra Kollontai met Rosa Luxemburg. And in 1908, in addressing at one of I think it was Old Russian Women's Congress in St. Petersburg, she said something like, the woman question, say the feminists of the educated classes, like liberal, bourgeois feminists, is a question of law and justice, right? And the woman question, the proletarian woman answers, is a question of a piece of bread. And that stuck with me when I was doing my archival research, because I thought, surely we can go beyond a piece of bread also, right? But at the same time, we're looking into, it was much more radical and materialist in terms of redistributing and transforming social reproduction in everyday life, whereas now we are kind of stuck at a little bit more and a little bit less, instead of a radical and winning radically. Okay, that's it. I shut up.
Yeah, let me just say that this is also something that Sophie Lewis has really written about great in her review of Kristen Gotzi's book. That's sort of one of the places that really started me sort of thinking about this. So that's a great piece. Okay, Sopo, are you up next?
Unless somebody else wants to go before me as well. I'm always like, choose a second. Yeah, I think first, Julia, your what you said was so beautiful and really well put. I would like to just say that I really, really enjoyed it. You explained things in such a great way. Yeah, I think actually I'm really glad Oleana brought this up, because one of the projects we're doing in Georgia is reimagining Soviet Georgia, is an actual oral history and podcast. So this is like the elephant in the room that is always there, but people keep talking about, around it, but it's just until we really go back and understand it. And it's actually the workers themselves that made me question the Soviet Union, because I had a much more negative idea being, raised in the US. There's the sort of the leftism that does exist in the US is much more critical. Well, there's kind of divided, but coming here is I was interviewing seamstresses in a small town, and we were asking about how many kids they had and if they had maternity leave. And there was this like one woman, everyone had children after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. And they're like, yeah, our job was gone, you know, we were poor, like all this stuff. And this woman was like, no, I had a child during the Soviet Union and they kept my job. I had 2 years off, raised my kid, and then went back to the same job and everything was fine. And then she said I had 2 other kids after that and it was a disaster. And now I work in this, you know, unstable workplace. It's a seamstress where we sometimes work, you know, 100 hours a week and sometimes we have no job. So it was really interesting. That was one of the first conversations I had with seamstresses. And they're the ones who made me question at how important it was, the stability factor of work for women, especially having maternity leave. So even having, you know, talking about like violence in other ways, because, you know, we know that violence is also has a lot to do with power, right? And them being beaten up at like not having a job, like it accelerates and a lot of problems when you have, you know, like, you know, money issues every day. You know, you're being degraded all the time, you know, at work now because there's like almost no labor laws that are very strong. They treat you very bad. Like bosses are even worse than say other places, you know, because there's no way to mediate them because there's such weak, you know, laws and movements and workers' positions and so on. So there's a lot that we can say about it. And I think it's really important to, you know, really think about these things more and also just, you know, make people understand why it's important for, like, especially in Georgian context, like why is important, like Polish experience, you know, important for Georgians. I think those things are very disconnected because it's not tangible. So a lot of times, like, you know, I said this recently, there was like this elite war that's continuing on, just elites just like literally just eating themselves alive. It's like one of the worst things to watch. And I guess like some Western like people who live here and other whatever media were like kind of confused as to why most Georgians like didn't care about like political and civil rights as much, you know, like. And when I said like, you know, poor working class people and like just in general Georgians who are working or, you know, are not working are concerned with like bread and butter issues, and they don't have like an abstract allegiance to some liberal values, you know, that some imagination of the West, everyone just like wants freedom or some you know, very basic the way they conceive it. And the same thing a lot of times, there's no allegiance, like as much as I want people to also have an allegiance to certain things or even internationalism, which I'm, you know, again, like huge, you know, believer in internationalism. So there's no like, it's not an abstract allegiance. Something has to sort of yield from it for them to be interested in it. And so that's been really a huge challenge, trying to figure out what that might look like. I still don't know. East is like a really good experiment. At least there's like, you know, engagement, but still like, you know, language is like a huge barrier. You know, a lot of workers don't know English. And so like, if that becomes already a problem to then interact, also a lot of, you know, just having experience with working on Lev Fem. I want to put that there, also one of the people who founded East, you know, one of the first meetings we had, you know, they commissioned all these articles and we translated them into Georgian, and then we added like 6 or 7 Georgian articles to it about social reproduction in different spheres. And so we have a book coming out in Georgian, which I'm very happy about because we translated, but it was like a lot of resources and time and like trying to find someone to actually pay somebody who translates them and edits them. So it was a lot of effort to have something in Georgian that people can read because they cannot, but you can also tell in these exchanges that they don't also, like, workers need time to, at least our workers, like women workers that we deal with, are not as comfortable in these kinds of platforms. Like there's like multiple exposures need to happen with the same people over and over again, you know, like a certain core has to come together as well because it's so alien to them and they're not used to it, and they feel that also some of the theoretical stuff they don't understand. So it's like a lot of work, you know, which I think we should do. It's just like a very slow process, and trying to figure these things out has been very challenging. And this book is one way that we're trying to do it. And I think like, I know every time we have meetings, and we've had like, Transnational Social Strike come to Georgia. It was a very productive, wonderful meeting. And for all these Georgians, like different kinds of workers, meet, Italians who are having similar problems. I remember they're like, really, in EU this happens too, so it was really great. Like every time we have these kinds of meetings, every worker feels so much like more connected and thoughtful, and it's so helpful. But ranking those things first, it was like these meetings are not as helpful because people need to be physically there and stuff, but like it's a lot of money and a lot of effort, and you don't always have people who will finance these things. So that's definitely a huge problem that we are trying to figure all the time, trying to figure out ways to make it happen. I'm also like interested in what are all of you doing as well, to how would we make this work even more.
Well, one thing we talked about during our previous event, which was a lecture by Anna Rosińska, who's a sociologist from Poland, but working in the States and in Italy with domestic workers. And sort of a thing that we imagine could be in some way sort of, exploring that affect of, wow, people in the West have that problem as well. And that sort of identification would be maybe possibly organizing events with migrant workers from sort of a given country, migrant workers from Poland, for example, who work in the States, who work in Italy, who work in Switzerland. That brings down the language barrier, makes it sort of emotionally way more sort of inviting for workers, and is a possibility to sort of do this internationalist exchange of experiences in a way that really doesn't require translations and making people comfortable with the language barrier, maybe feel excluded. So that's one idea we came up with in terms of what can remedy these problems that maybe we will be exploring in terms of organizing stuff in the future. But that's just one thing. And I think the crucial thing is that, organizing is work, organizing is labor, it's time. But we should be doing that work once again, as you've said. Anna or Julia, do you have anything to add? We will have to be sort of wrapping up the debate part soon because we have a Q&A to do. We can't have like a 3-hour event. But if you have something to add shortly. Yeah, Julia, want to say something?
There are so many interesting themes and topics at the moment that it's hard to pick one. But I was also thinking about the state socialism legacy and I wouldn't say that there is much of a huge nostalgia for the period because it's very covered in the discourse on the dissident discourse, the opposition against communist discourse, and it is also, I would say that almost each government after 1990 was developing this kind of narrative with the current one especially. But at the same time, I think we are observing two interesting phenomena, and one is that there is a certain form of rediscovery of legacy of state socialism in terms of infrastructure, of what you already said about the job security, about the if we look at the research on the families in cities like Łódź, a textile capital of Poland that was hit by restructuring and huge unemployment in 1990s, we can see that there were whole families that lived on a pension of the grandmother because she was the one who had the stable employment during state socialism, and she had children. She could afford children and working and without much stress about losing job. But I would say that as I said, there is some kind of rediscovery that perhaps not everything about state socialism was so bad. But what I found very interesting is another rediscovery, rather say, discovery is the discovery of the women actions in state socialism and how much they were rooted in the social reproduction issues. So it's really interesting that on one hand, we had a system that was beneficial in terms of social reproduction. So there was the care infrastructure, the participation on labor market and the job security. But at the same time, it was not enough. And it was not, and what I find personally fascinating was that women were always capable and active about forming a political agenda about their social reproduction needs and organizing and confronting the state authorities and the state power. So when we, for example, think about reproduction rights, of course, it is usually said that abortion was on demand in state socialism, but actually, at least in case of Poland, it was won by women in 1956. It was not given by the state, it was won by women who struggled for it and actually won it. In early 1960s, nurses were demonstrating against poor wages, poor working conditions and horrible housing. So this is not the knowledge that you have in the historical guide, like handbooks in schools, but because you only learn about the dissidents, about the fight for independence and the fight with communism. But there's this long story of social reproduction struggles. Sex workers in state socialism staged protest actions demanding, I mean, they were able to acknowledge their collective interest and fight for it. The famous hunger demonstrations in 1980, when women in Łódź organized a hunger march with their children in pushchairs, protesting against, well, famine, actually. I mean, that the wages and the access to food was on such a low level that their families were struggling and they were constantly underfed. And what is interesting that those struggles were successful. And it is, I think it's another layer of this, that I mean, the women who were fighting for reproductive rights won, and the nurses won, and the female textile workers also won. So we are not only not learning about women's activism, and we are not learning about women activism. We are not learning about women activism in social reproduction. We are not learning about that it was successful. This is something that that is worth. I mean, I think we should always look back and think who were our I mean, that because women are very often told that we are doing things from the beginning, and while there is a huge and rich history behind us of women's struggles, and this is something that, so I'm really glad there are more and more books about it, but books are not enough. It's the talking, it's the formation of narrative to different audiences, so to create this kind of inspiration.
I would just quickly say something, because I know that we are running around, out of time. So I want to make 2 points. One is related to, both are kind of related to the history of, let's say, socialist experiment, I would rather call it, because especially in the case of Yugoslavia, it was a very complicated situation. I would say, socialism, there was like small experiments within this structure, whatever it was. It was, there are discussions now, was it like I don't know, like state capitalism, or it was this and that, but I prefer to see it as a kind of field of experiments. And some of these experiments are very interesting, and sometimes they work, sometimes they didn't. But I think that my point here is that we should also try to common this experience and knowledge, beyond our national countries. Because I think, for instance, in Yugoslavia, there was a lot of interesting experimentation happening. So I would just say 3 most obvious things. One is the experiment with the property without proprietor. This is societal property. This is very experimental, very innovative, didn't work totally, but to some extent, we had some results. Self-management, introducing direct democracy in all spheres of life, not only in the labor process, but also in self-management in the way you organize your everyday life, your neighborhoods, and so on. Didn't work very well. Not everywhere, but there were some points, where we could, kind of learn from. And this alternative modernization. They say that we will never modern, but for instance, in Yugoslavia, we had this non-aligned modernism, this is, and it's a legitimate thing to think and learn from. Not perfect at all, full of problems, minefield, but still an alternative idea to the narratives that we already have. So this is one point. And the second point that I want to bring to the table is how do we actually learn? I really like Julia's point about, that this is not something that it was given to us, but, we fought for it. In somewhere around the time where new constitution in Yugoslavia was about to be voted, I think somewhere around 1973, there was this group of women in the city where I come from, it's called Pančevo, that self-organized. They used one of these self-management structures that were in the neighborhood to discuss, this new constitution. And they said, what about us? We are housewives, and there is nothing about us in this constitution. So what do we do about that? So they started this campaign. They wrote to all the representative bodies and, women newspapers. It was quite some campaign, and they actually had a public debate, on televisions everywhere, about, what to do with this issue. Because, the ideal was, there was, Yugoslavia was a very complicated project, but to, there was this horizon of, removing the state and creating, this Marx original idea of communes that collaborate with each other and so on. Never happened. But, it very went wrong at some point. But this was very, for me, this is very interesting point, because this country was based on, ideal of full employment. And once the global crisis started, the full employment was impossible. So they started exporting people to Germany, France, as a cheap labor force. And, the women had to stop working and go back to home. And, my question that comes from this struggle, they raised this question, but they didn't manage to change anything substantially, is, how do we think about that, now in our struggle, what is our horizon? Because from what I see in Serbia, the horizon of labor is, we want decent, jobs, is this really what we want, to be exploited better? I know this can be a temporary, solution, but how do we set, a kind of horizon for our struggles. And maybe, I mean, this is what I wanted to offer. I mean, this is like a, you know, in the spheres of fantasy still, but maybe this is the, you know, international organizing is the space where we can, you know, like really push that horizon further and try to imagine, you know, like some ways to do things better than before.
I really like that. I like the idea of really leading with an experimental mindset in our organizing, and not overlooking the good stuff that is available to us in terms of Eastern European history and the history of women's struggles, history of labor struggles here, but then also not falling into some naive fascination that overlooks all the problems that stemmed from the party farm and women's organizations that to a large degree tied themselves or were tied to the state exclusively. We have 20 minutes left till 8 o'clock, but I would really love for Anna and Soko to briefly talk about the East Manifesto. I think that since we so strongly focused on concrete struggle and trying to voice and imagine our political horizon, I think it's important that we close with that and that you speak about the manifesto, speak about the demands of East. Okay, so could you do that? And then we will move on to the Q&A so that everyone sort of knows the demands and can also ask questions based on that.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to? I mean, I can just briefly say something and then you can continue. I mean, for me, the importance of East and East Manifesto was really to try to address these different systemic violences in our societies and call it a feminist struggle. So this was, I think, the first thing that we did, like naming all of these things, the fields of feminist struggle. Because, for instance, housing struggles are not always named as being feminist. So I think this is, and also calling like migrant struggles, you know, feminist struggles. And this is something very important that we opened up to, you know, welcome all of these systemic violences that are happening and to try to offer the feminist perspective on them. So this is one value of this process that I see at this point. And a second set of like experimental also like stuff and values and I don't know, thinking around is the thinking around strike, because this is something that started, you know, like in the last years in Poland, in Argentina, and you know, it spread all over the world as a kind of I don't know, unifier of feminist struggles, as a sort of like a horizon, wannabe idea, I mean, impossible idea, even I would say, you know, like because it is very complicated to, you know, like strike in the sector of reproduction. But we can reclaim this space because, like, factory did explode, you know, like it's everywhere now, you know, like it's in every pore of our society, and they're extracting everything from us, and it's now very, very visible that, you know, like that this system is just not letting us breathe anymore, you know, like, and this idea of kind of trying to detach ourselves from this form of attraction is this experimental thinking around strike. So it is naming different resistances as strike. This is how I see it. It's not really about, you know, like a factory strike. And it is really not about just not doing anything. It's like naming, you know, one of your actions to be a part of this this struggle that we call strike.
Yeah, I think the manifesto is much more inclusive. I think that it also goes to the heart of the sort of lie that's been perpetuated by liberal feminism, which is that somehow socialist feminists or materialist feminists don't care about like other rights besides material. It's actually not true. The difference between actually more leftist, socialist, and liberal has always been about that liberals have never cared about material things, while we've cared about both, right? I just want to make that like line. This always happens, that it's this like misconception that's constantly being repeated. So I think that it's it's like the manifesto talks about social reproduction in a way like, if a person is like, if we are like our labor power commodities being produced, right? You need the materials and you need the worker, right? Just like a cup is being made. So you need the materials, you need the houses, you need the food, you need the medicine, you need those people that the mother, the teacher, the whatever, the workers that are part of this. And then you have also, including, sex work and also including like care work, which is part of also like, sexuality and things. So in a way, it encompasses all, in the whole sphere of social reproduction, either you're how to get social reproduction, so you reproduce yourself, and also if you're working in it as well to get the money to then also reproduce yourself. So once we frame it in that way, I think like it all kind of clicks, then we're much more inclusive in the ways that we discuss it. And then knowing also this part about addition that, immigration, migrants, and since a lot of, again, our countries are sort of split, the populations are half there and half there, or a third, whatever, different, it's really important for us to also have that link of migrants as well. So I think it's like a really, hopefully, takes off even more, but it's very inclusive and a different way of looking at it that may challenge. It's also much more difficult to pull off, of course. And now also, as Anna said, I really like the commitment to militancy, as women. And I think that it's not just like, we're going to talk or whatever, but it's like, no, we're going to strike, we're going to do things, we're going to withdraw, from the sphere if necessary to get our points across. So I really, really appreciate and fully support the militancy and also the sort of whole person, way of thinking about women, and also just in general humankind. So that's about it.
Okay, so now let's finally move on to the Q&A. Everyone that's on Zoom with us can just ask their questions directly in the chat. And I know that all the questions that are on Facebook will be sent to us, so that will be monitored. I saw that Anna Rosińska wrote on Facebook, I guess when I was mentioning her previous lecture, that the domestic workers movement in the US is applying the language justice approach even within one country. So providing all the contents in as many languages as needed, even 5 or 8 at a time. And it is costly, but they deem it necessary to build an inclusive platform. So I guess that's more the comment that's encouraging in terms of the effort it takes to actually communicate and build an inclusive movement across borders. And there's a question from Ida Slenzak, so one of our curators. What reproductive alternatives do you see for the nuclear family and neoliberal state for the near future? What are your hopes, especially in the context of nuclear family among working class is rather a new invention?
Should I, maybe I talked about it. Or did you, Sopo, you go ahead.
No, I was actually gonna be like, I don't understand the question, but go ahead if you understand the question.
I think I can explain it a bit. It's a question about sort of what forms of social reproduction and organizing social reproduction beyond just the nuclear family and the neoliberal state are available to us? Which ones do you think are feasible? I guess that would be a question about sort of the commune as an alternative form, for example, of social reproduction, which is one that's possible to build within the neoliberal state against the family form, and others that are sort of autonomous institutions of social reproduction that go beyond the form of a struggle or strike and attempt to build an alternative form in real existing capitalism, if I understand the question correctly.
I think
go, Elena.
If you have a better idea. Okay, I can just say a couple of things. I mean, I don't really know what are the alternatives, but they are, I mean, like the alternatives, but they are like, there are everyday alternatives that we also have in our society. So no, for instance, like during the pandemic, there was like explosion of mutual aid initiatives in Serbia and all around the world. So this is alternative form of social reproduction. So this is, you know, like the state doesn't want to help us. It doesn't give us what is ours. So we need to do something about it. So we become the kind of machine for, you know, redistribution and creating different ways of reproducing our lives, because the state is producing that, it's socializing that, you know, like with all the people who are in the bottom. I would say that also doing direct action, like stopping evictions, is doing social reproduction, because you know, like the state wants to take from us the basic means of social reproduction. We are just not willing to give it away. So this is work, this is labor that we are putting, you know, like in these struggles. So there are alternatives. I mean, you know, people are organizing, self-organizing, doing things to self-sustain themselves. They're thinking about alternatives. There's a lot of examples of that. So this is just what I wanted to say.
Okay, are there any more questions? Kinga Kurusha would like to emphasize more on the financialization and primitive accumulation context during the neoliberal era. So would any one of you would like to sort of speak more about it shortly? I think it's also, if I may sort of add something for myself very shortly, I think it's important that we, and this has been something that's been very sort of close to me in my own thinking recently, that a myth that's important to sort of attack and transform is the myth that neoliberalism and the family form are somehow opposites, right? And a person whose writing has been sort of a companion in my thinking most of all has been Melinda Cooper, who's an Australian sociologist who writes about the place of the nuclear family in neoliberal thinkers and economists' actual writing. She actually dug into all of that. You know, mostly American writing on neoliberal projects, and thought that the family form is actually extremely important to them. And preserving that is actually seen as, well, making sure there is a structure onto which they can privatize all of that labor, right? That is being turned, that is being enclosed on in terms of public services. So that, I think, is a crucial task in terms of our theorizing, in terms of intellectual work.
I think that also in terms of this particular comment on primitive accumulation, financialization, in my own work, I found it, I found also Silvia Federici's views interesting. Obviously, I mean, she's amazing on this, but she, you know, argues on this financialization of social reproduction is that a number of services that were formerly state subsidized, and say in the same way as in the Soviet Union, you know, daycare, education, etc., were kind of socialized by the state. Now these reproductive activities have become immediate sites of capital accumulation, where credit is seen as an investment, and household members as entrepreneurs. And very often it's women who become the entrepreneurs, the kind of responsible spenders of the cash transfer, the responsible spenders of the money. And it's often the mothers, like for instance, the maternity capital benefit in Russia, it's the mothers who are the natural recipients, and the father receives this benefit only if the mother is dead or has been kind of accused of like violence against the child or something like this. Like, it's very interesting, right? And so now women, and there's this common frame, kind of a narrative about male irresponsibility with money in general. And I think that also is interesting, the way in which then this whole responsibility is placed on the woman or on the mother, or on the caregiver in the family, right? As an entrepreneur, as an investor. Yeah.
I'm very interested in your sort of critiques of the Russian family benefit system, because that has been very central to a lot of discussions around the supposedly social aspect of the current Polish government, which I think often overlooks sort of left-wing approaches to that program, often overlook sort of social reproduction aspect of it, and the privatizing aspect it has. So I think that's a very important way of looking at it and critiquing it as a way of really moving social resources in a financialized, privatized way that sort of only a very sort of normative, heteronormative family can receive. So I think that's an important critique to also include in our thinking. Are there any more questions, either on the chat or on Facebook? We still have a bit of time. So we could take...
I can also just answer like a couple of things of why loans are also important in Georgia, is that because the class struggle is so low, people have to take out loans because the wages are below subsistence level. So it's a way to subsidize just surviving. So one of the biggest things, we're doing a research on nurses, which Julia, by the way, I would love to know more about your work with nurses, but we've been trying to organize nurses and doing like a couple of studies and so on. And like almost, I think a huge amount of them, almost all of them had taken out, one of the questions was like, have you had to take out a loan to cover your, basic needs? And almost everyone said yes. And they continue to have, they also like don't have even like calories, like enough calories in their food and nutrients, and just really brutal picture here. And so with absolutely everything else being privatized and being taken out of their accessibility, is loans have become very, very important. Especially like we had like payday loans and like crazy loans, like 5,000%. Like it was they had like limited some online 5-minute or 15-minute loans, but it was out of control. And we also have this other problem, which kind of goes into the whole financialization, which is gambling, casinos everywhere, no regulation, casinos. That also goes into people like selling their, like mortgaging their homes underneath like the parents that were living there, and the parents didn't know, and then like they were evicted because, you know, their son was addicted to gambling and mortgaged the house. Just so many examples like that. There's also like loan sharks that work sort of outside, not quite within the official financial edition for different networks. We don't have that many. We only have really just banks, really, that's official. We don't have all these other kinds of financial instruments that like other parts of the like West has. But we have these like informal like loan sharks types that also steal your home. That's even harder to combat. And like and you don't know who it is, and it's like some kind of whatever. It's like very informal, and it's slightly confusing for me to understand. So it's like a much different layers of what's happening within how are people surviving, and taking credit or loans or indebtedness is like has become a central part of survival. And one of the things that's important as well, what they did with pension, their pension reform, private pension here, is so they could create a savings so they could get more loans for the country. So it was like a way to leverage, and no, even though like it's like a really, I don't want to get into pay as you go versus like, you know, like different kinds of like pension system, but let's say it's mostly private, whatever you put in, plus they're going to put it in different stock markets and portfolios, and whatever you get is what you're going to get back. Not like a solidarity system of like you put in a certain amount, but if you needed more for a living wage, you can get more. Not like that. It's very much exactly how much you put in, you get back out, plus percentages of them playing with your money. And they also did this again to get higher rankings in the, you know, competition over foreign direct investment, have a certain point of, you know, because they always had very low savings rates, and also using that to generate more like a financial market that was lacking. It's not as developed because of the lack of like certain financial instruments. So it's a very like it's actually it's so connected with, you know, social reproduction.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that I also think that the social reproduction is very connected to debt and how the debt plays out in Eastern Europe. So for instance, in Serbia, this crisis of eviction is actually connected to that, because, you know, the housing, the ones that people, the users of their flats privatized in the 90s, are now the basic the last resort of their survival. So these houses are actually sold on auctions, you know, to repay the debt. And just recently, like a few months ago, the state of Serbia announced that it will hand to private bailiffs 1 million of so-called, we call it historical debt, the debt that was accumulated in the last 20 and 30 years. It's like a household debt, mainly like unpaid bills and so on, that people will have to face now. And the organizations that I'm part of, the RUF, is now trying to you know, make a campaign around that and work around this dismantling these narratives around the ideology of that, because, you know, like the ideology of irresponsible person who you know, just took a loan and now, you know, the loan has to be returned. So I think this is still a dominant narrative in Eastern Europe, and we have to work with that.
But I would like to add one thing that that actually shows that social reproduction is the political key, because for many years, September was late August and September was the time for when the loan, like those private loan companies, were harvesting, because parents were loaning, taking extra money to buy the textbooks for children, because they were not subsidized by the state. And several years ago, the state started to subsidize, and this was I would say, I think that this was like a game changer for many for many families. So the subsidized textbooks, and then this relatively generous family benefits offered by Law and Justice. These are the two keys for the popularity. And I mean, we had the parliament elections and the president elections. And I mean, this, of course, these government and presidents are horrible, but as long as other political parties will not understand that the social reproduction is the key, it will not be challenged. And on the what is interesting for me now is that the situation was abortion ban that was going on in Poland, because it's another struggle for social reproduction, and actually this time government is against it. So I'm really interested if this will be another changing point and another game changer for the discussion on political aspects of social reproduction. So perhaps this time it will be the failure of the government, but we'll see. There is still some time until the next elections, but it's actually the first time that they went against the social needs for social reproduction, which is interesting itself.
Yeah, but I think also social reproduction is the field where we're actually able to attack them as well, because there are sort of glaring blind spots. One would be healthcare, the other one would be housing, right? That's two fields where the rate at which housing is getting more expensive in Poland now is just absolutely enormous. And healthcare is also something that has been privatized and sort of falling in disarray. So I think it's important to remember that we can ask for more, and our organizing should sort of see that political horizon of not getting discouraged by the fact that the government is popular because of some reproduction-friendly legislation, and that we can fight for more than a piece of bread, as Yuvalina framed it. Okay, I think we're slowly going to wrap up. There are no more questions, I guess. We can do a last call. Maybe someone will get a poll, but I think that's it in terms of the Q&A. I would like to maybe just using the opportunity, since we talked about that, advertise that our next event, our next lecture. Oh, Anna has to go, so maybe let's just say bye and thank you first. Thank you to all of you for agreeing to, for accepting our invitation and this great and very productive and just really warm, militant talk. I think it has given me a lot of avenues to explore in terms of future thinking and activism. And I hope it has been equally productive for you and our listeners as well. So thank you for your time. And Anna, if you have to go, then thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, it was really a great talk, and thank you all for sharing. And yeah, really hope that we will meet again some other occasion.
We will stay in touch and sort of have more energizing discussions and exchanges.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye. Okay, so now I want to just quickly advertise our next event, which is actually going to be a lecture on debt and social reproduction. It's going to be a lecture in Polish, sadly, for our guests, but maybe we can, I don't know, maybe we can ask for subtitles or something later. by Isabella Desperac, who's a Łódź-based sociologist. Would any of my co-curators remind me the date? Oh, it's the 18th, so that's simple. Okay, the 18th of March, 6 o'clock CET. Okay, so that's it. So everyone who's interested in hearing and talking more about the financialization of social reproduction and indebtedness as a mechanism of enclosing social reproduction infrastructures and labor power is obviously welcome to tune in 2 weeks. And to sum up today's talk, I would once again like to thank all of you for this really energizing exchange. I think we all have a lot of energy for further struggles, and ask you if there's anything you would like to sort of say in the end in terms of what people can support, share any links, any current ongoing struggles that you would like to make more visible.
Or just support your local trade unions.
Of course.
I'll actually leave with a story, like in November, actually on my birthday, so it's even more memorable. There was a man that emerged like a hero. He took people hostage at first, but his demand was to lower interest rates and end gambling and make medicine cheaper. And his demands, and no one got hurt, everything ended up fine. It was actually all the hostages were like with him and like being like, no, you should actually lower it even more. Like what he was asking percentages, they were like arguing with him, they should be even lower. But like it was like an amazing thing that emerged, that people are, because there's also like movements are sort of scarce, as much as we try, that these one act heroes emerge. But like how much people have been like suffering, that this man like takes hostages to talk about like loan percentages. Like it's kind of an absurd situation. So he really resonated with everyone. Everyone like came to his defense, even though he's facing prison and so on. And that's like an interesting story at the end to like say where Georgia is at as far as in sort of class struggle and like what's happening around social reproduction.
That's bleak. Yeah.
But I'm always hopeful though. I'm not like a pessimist at all.
Elena, do you have any?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone again, and I think it would be interesting to see your work in the future. It'd be interesting to see what happens in Poland actually with the kind of the new welfare state emerging, or kind of a form that it's taking, and how it's dealing with the family and social reproduction. So that would be great. Yeah, and to connect with all of you, Sophic, also in the future. Yeah, thanks so much. It was great.
Okay, so
thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
me too.
Very inspirational.
So good night, everybody. See you. Thanks for tuning in, and see you in 2 weeks at our lecture on debt and social reproduction.